Hi, welcome back to Science 1206, the Chemical Reactions Unit. I'm Ms. Ledwell, and in this video, we'll continue looking at some examples of writing chemical equations. Let's get started. In our next sample problem, we're given a description of the reaction, and we need to write a balanced equation. Here's our description. Sulfur reacts with chlorine gas to produce sulfur dichloride liquid. Our first step is to write an unbalanced skeleton equation. Some points to remember are: sulfur is a polyatomic element. It does not exist by itself, but as S8. And chlorine is a diatomic element that exists as Cl2. So our unbalanced skeleton equation is going to look like this. Notice I added the states in for sulfur and chlorine. I can get those from the periodic table. Also, it said chlorine gas in the description. And it told us that sulfur dichloride was a liquid, so the state is added in there. Next, we list each element underneath the corresponding side and count the number of atoms in the reactants and the products. So on our reactant side, we have 8 sulfur and 2 chlorine, and on our product side, we have 1 sulfur and 2 chlorine. There are 8 sulfur atoms on the reactant side, but notice there is only 1 on the product side. So we must balance the equation. Now we will add coefficients to balance the equation. We will add the coefficient 8 in front of sulfur dichloride. Once the change is made, we will recount the atoms and verify that we have a balanced equation. On our reactant side, we have 8 sulfur and 2 chlorine. On our product side, we have 8 sulfur and 16 chlorine. So the sulfur atoms are now balanced, but the chlorine atoms are not. We will add coefficients to balance the chlorine next. Now we will add the coefficients to balance the chlorine atoms. So we will put an 8 in front of chlorine on our reactant side. And once that change is made, we will recount the atoms and verify we have a balanced equation. On our reactant side, we have 8 sulfur and 16 chlorine. On our product side, we have 8 sulfur and 16 chlorine. Our equation is balanced because we have the same number of atoms on the reactant and product side. Now it's time for you to try balancing some chemical equations. Pause this instructional video and grab a pencil and some paper. Number your paper from 1 to 3. Be sure to leave some space between your numberings because you'll need to do some workings. As each description or word equation in the table on the next slide and the ones following are revealed, follow the steps to write a balanced equation. We will then review the correct answers one by one. Good luck, and after you number your paper, please resume this instructional video. Our first description tells us solid copper reacts with a solution of silver nitrate to produce aqueous copper 2 nitrate and silver metal. You may want to pause the video here while you balance this equation on your paper, and then press play again to reveal the answer. Let's go through the steps of the correct answer. So your first step is to write the skeleton equation, which looks like this. Next, you're going to count the number of atoms in the reactants and products underneath your skeleton equation. So I have 1 copper, 1 silver, and notice that I kept the nitrate together as a polyatomic ion because it appears on both sides. So I have 1 nitrate ion. On the product side, I have 1 copper, 1 silver, and 2 nitrate ions. Our third step is to add coefficients to balance the equation. So I'm going to put a 2 in front of the silver nitrate and a 2 in front of silver, and then I'll recheck to see if it's balanced. So step 4 is to recount the atoms and verify we have a balanced equation. I have 1 copper on both sides, 2 silver on both sides, and 2 nitrate ions on both sides. So I have a balanced equation. Let's go on to the next one. Our next description says aluminum bromide powder reacts with chlorine gas to produce aluminum chloride powder and liquid bromine. Follow the steps that we discussed to write the balanced equation for this description. For our answer, our first step would be to write the skeleton equation. Your skeleton equation would look like this. Next, we're going to count the number of atoms in the reactants and products. So on our reactant side, we have 1 aluminum, 3 bromine, and 2 chlorine. On our product side, we have 1 aluminum, 2 bromine, and 3 chlorine. Our third step then is to add coefficients to balance the equation. Once you've added your coefficients, and this is a trial and error process, so you might need to repeat this step a couple of times to get it right, then you're going to recount the atoms and verify you have a balanced equation. So we check and we have 2 aluminum on both sides, 6 bromine on both sides, and 6 chlorine on both sides. So this is a balanced chemical equation. Let's try one more. Our description says, potassium metal reacts with liquid water, yielding a potassium hydroxide solution and hydrogen gas. So your first step in writing a balanced equation is to take that description and write a skeleton equation, which will look like this. Some things to remember here is I was able to add the states next to the chemical formulas because it gave us that information in the description. And also hydrogen is a diatomic molecule, so I had to add the subscript 2 to hydrogen. My next step is to count the number of atoms in the reactants and products. So on my reactant side, I have 1 potassium, 2 hydrogen, and 1 oxygen. But on my product side, I have 1 potassium, 3 hydrogen, and 1 oxygen. So I need to balance this. I'm going to add coefficients to balance the equation. And again, you may need to do this a couple of times because it is a trial and error process. Add coefficients, check, add coefficients, check to see if it's balanced. So now we'll check to see if this one is balanced with the coefficients that I've added. I'm going to recount the atoms and verify that I have a balanced equation. On my reactant side, I have 2 potassium, and there's 2 potassium on the product side. I have 4 hydrogen on the reactant side and 4 on the product, 2 oxygen on the reactant side, and 2 on the product side. So now I have a balanced chemical equation. Now it's time to review. Complete the learning activities you'll find in Brightspace.